In the quiet countryside of Virginia, where morning mist clings to rolling hills and time moves at the pace of falling leaves, there stood a farm that locals spoke of only in whispers. The year was 1859, and the Holloway farm stretched across fertile land dotted with apple trees that grew in perfect, unnatural rows. The orchard was beautiful, too beautiful, some said, its branches heavy with fruit that gleamed like jewels in the autumn sun. But beauty, as the townspeople would learn, can hide the darkest of secrets. The Holloway twins, Clara and Samuel, were 15 years old that fateful autumn. They moved through the orchard like shadows given form, their pale skin almost translucent in the dappled light filtering through the apple boughs. Clara's dark hair hung in twin braids that swayed as she walked, while Samuel's identical eyes held depths that seemed older than his years. Together, they tended the trees with a devotion that bordered on worship, their fingers tracing bark as if reading ancient scriptures written in wooden sap. From the main road, travelers could see the farmhouse, a two-story structure painted white, but somehow always appearing gray in the shifting light. Smoke rose from its chimney in thin, steady columns, and the windows reflected the sky like closed eyes. It was a house that watched, and those who passed by quickened their pace without quite knowing why. The orchard itself seemed to breathe. Apple trees stood in formation, their branches intertwining overhead to create natural archways and hidden alcoves. The ground beneath was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot, but in certain spots, the earth appeared disturbed, as if something had been recently buried and covered over. The twins walked these paths daily, their bare feet making no sound on the soft soil, their voices carrying in languages that predated English settlements in Virginia. Local farmers often remarked on the extraordinary harvest the Holloways produced year after year. The apples were perfect, crimson and gold, sweet and crisp, with skin that seemed to glow from within. But those who ate them reported strange dreams, visions of roots growing through their bodies and whispered voices calling their names in the darkness. Most dismissed these experiences as imagination, but the wise ones learned to avoid Holloway fruit altogether. The twins' bond went beyond the typical connection shared by brothers and sisters. They moved in perfect synchronization, finishing each other's sentences and sharing glances that communicated volumes without words. When one was injured, the other felt the pain. When Clara laughed, Samuel's lips curved in an identical smile. It was as if they shared not just blood, but a single soul divided between two bodies. This unnatural closeness did not go unnoticed in the nearby town of Millbrook. The Holloway family's household operated under rules that seemed carved in stone rather than spoken aloud. Their father, Ezra Holloway, was a man of stern countenance and few words. His weathered hands bore scars that spoke of hard labor, but his eyes held secrets that cut deeper than any physical wound. He kept his children under strict control, their days structured around tending the orchard and maintaining the farm's eerie perfection. Ezra's presence commanded silence. When he entered a room, conversations died mid-sentence. His footsteps echoed through the farmhouse with the weight of authority, and his rare smiles held no warmth. He spoke to his children in clipped sentences, issuing instructions rather than holding conversations. Tend the eastern grove, he might say to Clara, or check the root cellars to Samuel. Never please, never thank you. Only commands delivered with the certainty of someone who expected absolute obedience. The children responded to their father's directives with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. They moved quickly to fulfill his wishes, their young faces lighting up at any sign of approval. But Ezra's approval came rarely, and his displeasure manifested in ways that made visitors to the farm uncomfortable. A sharp word from him could send Clara fleeing to the orchard in tears, or cause Samuel to stand motionless for hours, staring at nothing with hollow eyes. Their mother, Millicent Holloway, drifted through the farmhouse like a ghost haunting her former life. Once, she had been the belle of Millbrook, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk and a laugh that made men's hearts race. But marriage to Ezra had drained the color from her world, leaving her pale and insubstantial, as though she might fade entirely if someone looked away for too long. Millicent rarely spoke above a whisper. When she did address her children, it was with a tenderness that seemed almost painful, as if each word of affection caused her physical anguish. She would stroke Clara's hair while staring out the kitchen window at the orchard, her fingers trembling against the dark strands. Sometimes, visitors caught her lips moving in what appeared to be prayer, but the words she murmured belonged to no Christian denomination they recognized. The burden she carried was visible in every gesture. Her shoulders curved inward, protecting herself from invisible blows. Her hands shook when she thought no one was watching, and her eyes held a haunted quality that made strangers look away in discomfort. She moved through her days like someone following a script written in blood, performing tasks that brought her no joy but which she dared not abandon. The twins' unusual relationship became the subject of intense gossip throughout Millbrook. At church gatherings and market days, conversations inevitably turned to the strange children who seemed more like two halves of the same person than individual siblings. Their teachers reported that they answered questions in unison, wrote in identical handwriting, and refused to be separated even for brief periods. When one fell ill, the other would develop identical symptoms within hours. But those who pried too deeply into the Holloway family's affairs had a disturbing tendency to disappear from conversations altogether. The baker who once asked too many questions about the twins' education suddenly moved his family to Richmond without explanation. A traveling preacher who expressed concern about the children's spiritual well-being was found days later at the edge of town, his memory of recent events completely blank. These incidents weren't dramatic enough to spark official investigations, but they created an atmosphere of unspoken dread around anyone who showed too much curiosity about the Holloways. As autumn deepened and daylight hours shortened, the true nature of the Holloway farm began to reveal itself. When darkness claimed the Virginia countryside, normal families retired to their homes, lit their lamps, and settled in for peaceful evenings. But the Holloway farm came alive after sunset in ways that defied natural explanation. Neighbors living within hearing distance reported the sound of children's laughter echoing from the orchard long after midnight. But this wasn't the innocent joy of youth at play. These were voices that carried undertones of something ancient and knowing, laughter that spoke of secrets too dark for daylight. The sound would drift on the night air like smoke, penetrating closed windows and haunting the dreams of those unfortunate enough to hear it. Mrs. Henderson, whose farm bordered the Holloway property, swore she could distinguish individual words in the twins' nocturnal conversations. They spoke to each other in voices that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the orchard itself was participating in their dialogue. She claimed they addressed unseen companions by name, calling out to the ones who sleep beneath the roots, and the harvest mothers who came before. On clear nights, lantern lights could be seen moving between the apple trees in patterns that suggested ritual rather than random wandering. The lights bobbed and weaved through the orchard in complex configurations, sometimes forming circles, other times tracing symbols that viewers couldn't quite make out from a distance. When brave souls attempted to get closer for a better look, the lights would suddenly extinguish, leaving the orchard in complete darkness and silence. The most disturbing reports came from travelers passing by on the main road after midnight. They described seeing the entire Holloway family, father, mother, and twins, standing motionless among the apple trees, their faces turned toward the sky, as if receiving instructions from the stars themselves. These witnesses claimed the family remained perfectly still for hours, never speaking, never moving, just standing sentinel over their darkened orchard like gods protecting something precious and terrible. Local wildlife began avoiding the Holloway property altogether. Birds that once nested in the apple trees abandoned their homes, leaving the branches eerily silent during the day. Dogs refused to walk past the farm's entrance, whimpering and pulling against their leashes when their owners attempted to force them forward. Even insects seemed to give the orchard a wide berth, creating an unnatural quiet that made the twins' nighttime activities seem even more ominous by contrast. The transformation of the farm after dark was so complete that it might have been an entirely different place. The peaceful agricultural setting became something primordial and threatening, a landscape where ancient powers stirred and modern sensibilities held no sway. The very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the orchard was consuming oxygen and exhaling something else entirely. It was during these midnight hours that the orchard revealed its true nature. The apple trees, so beautiful and productive during daylight, cast shadows that moved independently of the wind. Their branches reached toward each other across the pathways, creating an interlocking canopy that blocked out the stars. The ground beneath gave off a warmth that had nothing to do with stored sunlight, and the scent of ripening fruit was underlaid with something else, something that reminded visitors of freshly turned earth and copper pennies. Young Thomas Crane arrived at the Holloway farm seeking work in October of 1859. He was 17, strong-backed and eager, desperate for employment before winter set in. Ezra Holloway hired him without much conversation, assigning him tasks that involved mainly physical labor, hauling water, mending fences, and preparing tools for the apple harvest. Thomas was not a superstitious boy. He'd grown up on neighboring farms and understood that rural communities often developed elaborate folklore around successful families. The whispers about the Holloways struck him as jealousy disguised as concern, the inevitable result of prosperity that others couldn't match. He approached his work with the practical mindset of someone who needed wages more than he needed to understand family secrets. But the orchard itself proved impossible to ignore. While clearing fallen branches near the eastern edge of the property, Thomas noticed irregularities in the ground that didn't match typical farming patterns. The soil between several apple trees had been disturbed, leaving mounds that were too uniform to be natural but too random to serve any agricultural purpose he could identify. The mounds were roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, arranged in no particular pattern, but always positioned between trees rather than in the walking paths. The earth covering them was darker than the surrounding soil, richer and more fertile, as if something beneath was feeding the ground from below. Apple trees nearest these disturbed areas produced fruit that was larger and more perfectly formed than anywhere else in the orchard, their branches heavy with crops that seemed to ripen overnight. When Thomas brought his discovery to Mr. Holloway's attention, expecting praise for his observational skills, Ezra's reaction was swift and severe. The older man's face darkened with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Without explanation, he ordered Thomas to gather his belongings and leave the property immediately. No final payment was offered, no reference provided, just a cold dismissal that brooked no argument. Thomas tried to protest, explaining that he needed the work and had done nothing wrong, but Ezra's response was to summon the twins from the orchard with a whistle that sounded more like a bird call than any human sound. Clara and Samuel materialized from between the apple trees with unsettling swiftness, their identical faces wearing expressions of polite interest that made Thomas's skin crawl. The twins said nothing, as their father explained that Thomas would be leaving immediately. They simply watched with those deep, knowing eyes, occasionally glancing at each other in silent communication. Their presence was enough to convince Thomas that arguing further would be unwise. He gathered his few possessions and left the Holloway farm that afternoon, but not before noticing that the twins had positioned themselves between him and the orchard, as if guarding against his return. Thomas never spoke of his brief employment at the Holloway farm to his family or friends. When asked about his sudden return, he claimed the work hadn't suited him and changed the subject. But those who knew him well noticed changes in his behavior, a tendency to avoid certain roads, an unwillingness to eat apples regardless of their origin, and a habit of checking over his shoulder when walking alone at night. The boy's abrupt dismissal created ripples of unease throughout the community. Thomas had a reputation for honest work and reliable character. His sudden departure from the Holloway farm, combined with his obvious reluctance to discuss the experience, suggested that he had encountered something beyond normal employment difficulties. Meanwhile, the twins seemed entirely unbothered by the incident. If anything, they appeared almost amused by Thomas's hasty retreat, sharing secret smiles and quiet laughter when they thought no one was observing. Their behavior suggested that such departures were not uncommon, that the Holloway family had experience in managing outsiders who discovered more than they should have. The mounds Thomas had discovered remained undisturbed, their dark soil continuing to nourish the apple trees above. Whatever lay beneath continued its silent work, feeding the orchard's supernatural productivity and maintaining the terrible beauty that drew visitors even as it repelled them. As winter approached and the lost apples were harvested, Millicent Holloway's fragile composure finally began to crack. The burden she had carried for so many years grew too heavy to bear in silence, and fragments of the family's dark history began spilling from her lips like blood from an untended wound. It started with whispered warnings to her children, moments of maternal concern that overcame her usual restraint. She would pull Clara aside while hanging laundry and speak in urgent tones about promises that should never have been made. She would catch Samuel alone in the root cellar and tell him about the price their family had paid for the orchard's prosperity, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she spoke. The twins received these revelations with the same unsettling calm they displayed toward everything else. They listened politely, nodded at appropriate intervals, but showed no signs of shock or fear at their mother's increasingly desperate confessions. Their lack of reaction only seemed to distress Millicent further, as if she had expected them to share her horror at the family's secrets. Late one November evening, as the first snow began to fall, Millicent found the courage to speak more plainly. She gathered her children in the kitchen, away from Ezra's hearing, and told them about the covenant their ancestors had made with forces that predated Christian settlement in Virginia. She spoke of blood mixed with soil, of children offered to ensure abundant harvests, of a curse that bound each generation to continue practices that civilized society had long forgotten. The orchard, she explained, was not just farmland. It was a sacred grove where ancient powers still held sway. The apple trees grew from soil enriched by human sacrifice, their roots intertwining with bones that had been buried there for generations. Each harvest required payment in blood, and the Holloway family had served as willing executioners for nearly a century, luring strangers to their property and ensuring they never left. But even as Millicent revealed these terrible truths, she seemed to be fighting against forces beyond her control. Her voice would fade mid-sentence, as if invisible hands were closing around her throat. She would pause and look toward the orchard with expressions of naked terror, as though something was calling her name from between the apple trees. Her warnings to the children became increasingly frantic. She begged them to flee the farm, to abandon their father and seek lives elsewhere. But Clara and Samuel listened to her pleas with the detached interest of adults humoring a confused child. They patted her hands and made soothing sounds, but showed no inclination to take her advice seriously. The breaking point came on a night when the first hard frost killed the last of the autumn flowers. Millicent was found in the kitchen at dawn, sitting at the table with her hands folded and her eyes staring at nothing. She had written a letter, pages and pages in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as it progressed, detailing the full extent of the Holloway family's crimes and pleading with whoever found it to stop the cycle of violence. But when Ezra discovered the letter, he burned it without reading more than the first few lines. Millicent made no protest as her confession turned to ash in the fireplace. She simply watched the flames consume her words, tears streaming down her face, and whispered apologies to victims whose names she had carried in her heart for years. That same day, Millicent Holloway vanished. Her husband claimed she had gone to visit relatives in Richmond, but no one could recall her mentioning any such plans. The twins showed no distress at their mother's absence, continuing their daily routines as if nothing had changed. They tended the orchard, helped with household chores, and maintained the same eerie composure that had always marked their behavior. Neighbors who asked about Millicent's whereabouts received polite but vague responses. She was resting, they were told, or she had needed a change of scenery. But as days turned to weeks with no word from her, the community began to suspect that Millicent Holloway had not left the farm voluntarily, and perhaps had not left it at all. The truth of her disappearance would remain one of many secrets buried in Holloway soil, another name added to the long list of those who had discovered too much about the orchard's dark harvest. Her absence created a void in the farmhouse that seemed to deepen the shadows and thicken the atmosphere of dread that surrounded the property. But for the twins, life continued without interruption. If anything, they seemed liberated by their mother's disappearance, freed from her increasingly desperate attempts to save them from their inherited destiny. They moved through their days with renewed purpose, as if Millicent's absence had removed the last obstacle to fulfilling whatever role the orchard required of them. As news of Millicent's disappearance spread through Millbrook, the community's long-suppressed fears about the Holloway family finally began to surface. Years of whispered concerns and uncomfortable questions crystallized into open suspicion, fueled by too many coincidences and too many unanswered questions to ignore any longer. The breaking point came when families throughout the area began reporting mysterious illnesses that seemed to center around one common factor: consumption of Holloway apples. The symptoms were unlike anything local doctors had encountered. Fever dreams filled with visions of roots growing through human flesh, an insatiable hunger that no amount of food could satisfy, and a compulsion to walk toward the Holloway orchard in the middle of the night. Children were particularly susceptible to these strange afflictions. They would wake screaming from nightmares about being buried alive among apple trees, their small hands clawing at imaginary soil covering their faces. Parents found their young ones standing at bedroom windows in the pre-dawn darkness, staring toward the Holloway property with expressions of longing that seemed utterly foreign to their innocent faces. Dr. Morrison, Millbrook's physician, documented case after case of what he termed orchard sickness, a condition that seemed to affect only those who had eaten fruit from the Holloway trees. His medical journal recorded symptoms that read more like folklore than clinical observation, patients speaking in languages they had never learned, temporary blindness accompanied by claims of seeing through soil, and an overwhelming desire to dig holes in their own gardens as if searching for something buried beneath. The town's religious leaders were equally disturbed by the spiritual implications of the outbreak. Reverend Walsh reported that several of his parishioners had confessed to dreams of participating in unholy rituals, dancing around apple trees while chanting words that burned their tongues to speak. These dream confessions shared disturbing similarities, as if multiple people were experiencing the same visions simultaneously. As superstition and fear spread through the community, the Holloway family retreated even deeper into isolation. Ezra ceased all contact with neighboring farms. The twins no longer attended the occasional social gatherings they had previously graced with their unsettling presence, and the family stopped selling their apples at the local market. They became completely self-sufficient, as if preparing for a siege. But their isolation only intensified the community's suspicions. Stories began circulating about the true nature of the Holloway orchard's fertility. Old-timers recalled previous generations speaking in hushed tones about the farm's supernatural productivity, and how each abundant harvest seemed to coincide with the disappearance of strangers passing through the area. The twins' response to the growing hostility was perhaps the most unnerving aspect of the situation. Rather than showing fear or concern about their family's reputation, Clara and Samuel seemed to relish the attention. They could be seen standing at the edge of their orchard at all hours of the day and night, watching the road with expressions of patient anticipation, as if waiting for something inevitable to occur. When brave or foolhardy townspeople attempted to approach the farm with questions or accusations, they found themselves unable to complete their missions. The twins' mere presence was enough to turn away the most determined investigators. They would stand silently among the apple trees, their identical faces wearing expressions of polite interest, but their eyes held depths that made visitors feel as though they were drowning in dark water. Some reported feeling physically ill when they came too close to the orchard, experiencing sudden nausea and disorientation that cleared only when they retreated to the main road. Others claimed the twins spoke to them without moving their lips, their voices echoing inside visitors' heads with messages that were forgotten as soon as they left the property, but which left lasting impressions of dread and warning. The family's untouchable quality became legendary in Millbrook. They seemed protected by forces that ordinary people couldn't comprehend or combat. Attempts to involve legal authorities were met with mysterious obstacles. Evidence disappearing overnight, witnesses forgetting crucial details, and officials finding excuses to delay or abandon investigations. As winter's grip tightened on Virginia, the tension between the Holloway family and the surrounding community reached a breaking point that would soon explode into terrible revelation. The orchard lay dormant under a blanket of snow, but the evil that had taken root there continued to grow, fed by generations of blood and sustained by the unwavering devotion of its guardians. The truth would emerge on a night when desperation finally overcame fear, when the people of Millbrook gathered courage born of collective outrage and marched toward the Holloway farm seeking answers that would shatter their understanding of the world they thought they knew. The orchard secrets, buried for so long beneath fertile soil and beautiful fruit, were about to be dragged into the harsh light of discovery. But some truths, once revealed, can never be forgotten. And some evils, once disturbed, refused to return quietly to their resting places beneath the earth. The reckoning was coming, carried on winter winds that whispered of justice and revenge, of ancient promises finally called due, and of a harvest that would be reaped in blood rather than gold. The Holloway twins stood ready to receive whatever judgment their neighbors might attempt to deliver, their pale faces serene with the knowledge that they served powers older and more terrible than anything mere mortals could comprehend or defeat. In the darkness of that final winter, as snow covered the orchard and ice formed on the apple branches, the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave Millbrook forever changed and the Holloway name spoken only in whispers by those brave enough to remember what had grown in the shadows between the trees. The storm came in March of 1860, arriving with winds that howled like the voices of the damned and rain that fell in sheets thick enough to drown standing men. It was the kind of tempest that old women claimed brought change, washing away the past to make room for terrible new beginnings. On this night, 23 men from Millbrook armed themselves with torches, shovels, and righteous fury, and marched through the driving rain toward the Holloway farm. They had planned this confrontation for weeks, meeting in barns and root cellars away from curious ears, sharing stories and suspicions until their collective fear transformed into desperate courage. Too many people had disappeared, too many children had fallen ill, too many questions had gone unanswered. The time for whispers and speculation had passed. Sheriff Coleman led the group, though his hands shook as he carried his lantern through the darkness. Behind him walked farmers and shopkeepers, fathers and sons united by the conviction that the Holloway family's reign of subtle terror must end. They moved like a procession of ghosts through the storm, their torches creating dancing shadows that seemed to mock their determination. The orchard revealed its secrets reluctantly, fighting them with every step. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them. Their torches flickered and threatened to die despite the oil that fed their flames, and the apple trees seemed to press closer together, creating a labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient intruders. But desperation made them persistent. They spread out among the trees, probing the ground with their shovels and calling out to each other through the storm. It was young James Fletcher who made the first discovery. His shovel struck something that was neither root nor stone, but yielded with a sickening give of rutted wood. What they unearthed that night would haunt Millbrook for generations. Shallow graves dotted the orchard like a macabre garden, some containing remains that were decades old, others holding victims of more recent vintage. But the bones were not the most disturbing discovery. Carved into the apple trees themselves, hidden beneath layers of bark that had grown over them like healing skin, were symbols that predated any known civilization in Virginia. The markings spoke of rituals older than Christianity, of blood offerings made to ensure fertile soil and abundant harvests. They found evidence of ceremonies performed in the darkness between the apple rows, circles of stone stained with substances that rain and time had failed to wash clean. The orchard was not just a burial ground. It was a temple dedicated to powers that civilized men were not meant to acknowledge. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the discovery that the twins were not merely witnesses to their family's crimes. They were active participants. Hidden among their possessions, the men found journals written in the children's identical handwriting, documenting years of ritual murders with a detached fascination of naturalists studying insects. The twins had not been corrupted by their environment. They had embraced it willingly, eagerly, as if they had been born for no other purpose than to serve the orchard's hunger. Clara and Samuel Holloway stood watching from the farmhouse porch as their family's secrets were dragged from the soil. They showed no fear, no shame, no recognition that their world was ending. Instead, they held hands and smiled identical smiles, as if the discovery was exactly what they had been waiting for. Their calm in the face of revelation was more terrifying than any display of guilt or panic could have been. Ezra Holloway met his accusers with the same stern silence he had shown throughout his life. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, he neither confirmed nor denied the charges. He simply stood in his doorway, watching the destruction of his orchard with the resignation of a man who had always known this moment would come. His only words, spoken just loud enough for the nearest men to hear, were a warning: "The roots run deeper than you know." The confrontation that should have brought justice brought only more questions. As the men of Millbrook stood among the violated graves, surrounded by evidence of generations of murder, they realized they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. The orchard was not just the scene of crimes. It was a living entity that had fed on human suffering for decades, growing stronger with each offering. The apple trees themselves seemed to be watching the proceedings, their bare branches reaching toward the searchers like grasping fingers. The wind through their limbs carried sounds that resembled whispered protests, as if the orchard was mourning the exposure of its carefully maintained secrets. The very ground beneath their feet pulsed with unnatural warmth, as though something vast and alive was stirring in the depths below. By dawn, the full extent of the Holloway family's crimes lay exposed beneath the gray March sky. 27 bodies were recovered from the orchard, some so decomposed that identification was impossible, others bearing evidence of ritual mutilation that spoke to purposes beyond simple murder. The apple trees that had grown from soil enriched by human remains stood as silent witnesses to decades of carefully orchestrated horror. But even as justice seemed within reach, the orchard prepared to extract its final, terrible price. The forces that had sustained the Holloway family for generations would not surrender their servants without exacting revenge on those who dared to disturb the ancient compact. The men of Millbrook had come seeking answers, but they would leave carrying curses that would poison their dreams for the rest of their lives. The stage was set for a conclusion that would satisfy neither the demands of justice nor the needs of closure. Some evils are too deeply rooted to be destroyed by exposure alone, and some secrets leave scars that never heal. The Holloway orchard had revealed its truths, but those truths would prove to be seeds of an even darker harvest yet to come. Fire claimed the Holloway farm on the night of March 20, 1860. The flames rose like prayers toward heaven, consuming everything that had sheltered the family's dark secrets for generations. The farmhouse burned first, its white-painted walls blackening and peeling away to reveal the rotted timbers beneath. Windows exploded outward in showers of glass that reflected the orange light like scattered stars, and the roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder rolling across the Virginia hills. But it was the orchard that burned most fiercely. The apple trees, their roots fed by decades of blood sacrifice, ignited with supernatural intensity. Each tree became a torch, its branches reaching upward like arms raised in supplication or surrender. The fire spread from tree to tree with impossible speed, as if the orchard itself was eager to embrace destruction rather than face the judgment of daylight. The flames burned colors that fire should not burn, deep purples that hurt to look at directly, greens that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and blues so dark they appeared almost black. The smoke that rose from the burning orchard carried scents of things that had never grown in Virginia soil, exotic spices from distant lands, flowers that bloomed only in dreams, and underneath it all, the copper tang of spilled blood. Witnesses to the conflagration reported hearing voices in the flames, not the crackling of burning wood, but actual human voices speaking in languages that predated any known civilization. The fire seemed to be releasing not just smoke and heat, but the accumulated anguish of every soul that had been sacrificed to ensure the orchard's terrible prosperity. Decades of suppressed screams rose with the flames, finally free to voice their protests to the uncaring sky. The townspeople watched from a safe distance, their faces lit by the hellish glow, their eyes wide with a mixture of relief and horror. They had come seeking justice, but what they witnessed felt more like divine retribution, as if the earth itself was purging the corruption that had taken root in Holloway soil. Some fell to their knees and prayed, others wept openly, and more than a few would later claim they saw shapes moving within the flames, the spirits of the murdered finally finding release. But where were the twins? Clara and Samuel Holloway were nowhere to be found when the flames began to spread. Their father's body was discovered in the farmhouse cellar, but the children had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Some claimed to have seen them standing among the burning apple trees, their pale forms visible for brief moments between the shifting flames before disappearing again into the supernatural fire. Others swore the twins had fled into the night before the burning began, carrying with them whatever dark knowledge their family had accumulated over the generations. These witnesses reported seeing two small figures moving away from the farm as the first flames took hold, walking hand in hand down the road that led toward Richmond, their identical faces serene despite the destruction behind them. The search for Clara and Samuel Holloway consumed the surrounding counties for months. Posses of armed men scoured the countryside, following every reported sighting and investigating every rumor. But the twins seemed to have dissolved into the Virginia landscape like smoke, leaving no trace of their passage except for the occasional report of strange dreams experienced by those who claimed to have encountered them. As the fire burned through the night, it revealed final secrets that the orchard had kept buried beneath its roots. The flames exposed a network of tunnels and chambers that honeycombed the ground beneath the apple trees, evidence of a cult that had operated in darkness for far longer than anyone had suspected. The Holloway family had been merely the most recent guardians of something ancient and evil, caretakers of traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of human settlement in the Americas. By morning, nothing remained of the Holloway farm except charred foundations and acres of blackened stumps where the orchard had once flourished. The fire had burned so hot and so completely that even the bones buried between the apple trees had been reduced to ash that blew away on the March wind. It was as if the entire property had been cleansed by flame, purified of the corruption that had poisoned it for generations. But those who knew about such things whispered that fire alone could not destroy what had grown in Holloway soil. Evil that deep, that well established, could not be erased by mere combustion. The roots might be boned, but the seeds had already been scattered. The twins were still out there somewhere, carrying their family's terrible legacy to new ground, new orchards, new victims who would never suspect the true nature of the beautiful fruit they were offered. In the weeks that followed the fire, the people of Millbrook tried to return to normal life, but the stain of what they had discovered could not be easily washed away. Children who had played in sight of the Holloway orchard now woke screaming from nightmares of being buried alive. Adults found themselves unable to eat apples without remembering the taste of fear in their mouths. The very landscape seemed changed, as if the fire had burned away not just buildings and trees, but some essential quality that had made the area feel like home. Reports began filtering in from neighboring counties of a brother and sister matching the twins' description, always traveling together, always seeking employment on farms with apple orchards. They were polite children, these witnesses reported, helpful and hardworking, but there was something about their eyes that made people uncomfortable. Animals avoided them, babies cried when they came near, and apple trees in their vicinity produced fruit that tasted wrong despite appearing perfect. The Holloway curse, it seemed, had not died with the farm. It had simply found new soil in which to take root, new guardians to tend its dark growth. Clara and Samuel carried their inheritance not in their possessions, but in their blood, in the ancient knowledge that had been passed down through generations of their family. They were seeds themselves, scattered by the wind of circumstances to sprout wherever conditions were right for their particular brand of evil to flourish. As autumn returned to Virginia and apple harvest time approached throughout the region, farmers began reporting strange phenomena in their orchards. Trees that had been productive for decades suddenly bore fruit that rotted from within, their beautiful exteriors hiding corruption that spread like infection through entire crops. Wells near apple groves ran dry or became contaminated with water that tasted of copper and earth. And sometimes, in the pre-dawn darkness, neighbors reported seeing two small figures moving between the apple trees, tending the fruit with a devotion that seemed almost religious in its intensity. The people of Millbrook learned to avoid traveling after dark, to lock their doors against visitors who came.